Just before we get into today's video, just wanted to say a quick thank you to the historic city of Quincy, Massachusetts for teaming up with us yet again in sponsoring another of our The Story of America video series, covering so far everything from Amelia Earhart and the dawn of U.S. commercial aviation to the forgotten other guy who co-invented the telephone and helped make the U.S. a naval powerhouse, to the true story of the Amistad, to that time Ben Franklin and John Adams slept together and the hilarity that ensued, covering how those two men teamed up on multiple occasions to help create the United States, utilizing their own rather diametrically and sometimes humorously opposed methods. As for Quincy, which yes, is pronounced Quincy, not Quincy, the city is home to the Adams National Historic Park, which preserves the home of Presidents John Adams and John Quincy Adams. In Quincy, you can explore the birthplaces of these iconic individuals and walk the same halls as they once did, immersing yourself in the beginnings of the United States. But Quincy isn't all about the past. It's a city that beautifully blends history and present-day adventures and experiences, from the iconic USS Salem to the stunning views of the Blue Hills and the architectural elegance of Old City Hall and the Thomas Crane Library. There's something here for everyone. And let's not forget the Epicurean delight that is Quincy's food scene. With an array of global and local flavors, it's a culinary journey that you can't miss. To discover more of what Quincy has in store for you, check out discoverquincy.com. It's time to step into history and create some unforgettable memories. Now let's get into today's video. From humble beginnings to near orphan at 7, to one of the wealthiest people in America, to one of the first the British targeted as being someone no pardon would be given, to President of Congress and beyond, John Hancock led a rather interesting life, as we've been covering in this 5-part Hancock series. With a peace treaty finally announced in 1783 and his life no longer forfeit if the British prevailed, when he wasn't battling health issues, including severe issues with gout, John Hancock was otherwise governing the state of Massachusetts. It was in this role in 1785 when he was once again voted in as President of Congress, technically making him the first President of the United States to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms, given his former role as President of Congress during the early going of the war. Unfortunately, his health had deteriorated too much at this point, and he was unable to make the trip to Philadelphia to take office there directly. To add insult to injury, shortly after being elected, his 10-year-old son died in an ice skating accident in January of 1786. For reference, his only other child, a daughter Lydia, had also previously died as a baby about 10 years before this. Health poor, he finally resigned as president on June 6, 1786. But his work was not quite done for the United States, having one more critical role to play. As we've covered in great depth in our video, The Key to Humans Humaning, after John Adams, Ben Franklin and co. successfully negotiated the end of the American Revolution with the Treaty of Paris, signed by both sides on September 3, 1783, the United States had a major problem. Despite the name, its states were not exactly actually united, generally out to serve their own interests first, and, if convenient, those of their loose union. During the war, this was less of a problem as they had pressing need to work together. Now they didn't. Not only that, but in their quest to make a central government that was as purposefully weak as possible so as never to come to dominate in the way their former government did over them, they had gone too far, creating a government in the Articles of Confederation, or the so-called League of Friendship, that had, as George Washington so famously put, no money, and no real way to get any outside of printing some that was worthless. This was a rather glaring issue for countless reasons, right down to the then complete inability for the government to pay its debts or its soldiers, or for anything at all really. The central government also had very little power it could exert over the states, or make anything happen in many cases unless all the states agreed on it, which was an extreme rarity. This was a major immediate problem when considering, for example, the aforementioned Treaty of Paris between Britain and the United States that ended the war and gave incredibly favorable terms to the new country. The issue was many of the states saw little need to adhere to the treaty, and indeed were not, and there was very little the federal government could do about it. This could have potentially blown up in the young nation's face had Britain decided to also go back on the deal, potentially plunging the nation right back into a war it could not afford against a still very superior adversary, and this time perhaps not seeing the French have the United States' back after the US kind of threw them under the bus in negotiations with the British. In short, Congress had no real power to govern anything, the states knew it, and at a certain point, it even mostly ceased trying. All of this had been done very intentionally, giving the political minds among the colonists knew well most such attempts at similar governments in the past had ultimately devolved into some form of tyranny, whether tyranny of the majority or by those placed in power, regardless of what any laws put in place said. Not just in governments far afield or in the past, but this was something they themselves had seen with some of the then state legislatures abusing their positions in the colonies. George Washington would write of all this, "We have probably had too great an opinion of human nature in forming our confederation." And he further states the government they had made was a shadow without substance. Thus, it became clear to all that the Articles needed, at the very least, amended heavily if the nation in some form was to survive at all. After some deliberation about this, it was decided to convene to fix the problem with delegates from each state selected to represent the people in these changes, with 70 delegates from the 13 states selected, of which 55 ultimately attended the convention. Once there, they ultimately decided instead of modifying the Articles of Confederation, they would instead just come up with a brand new constitution. If you'd like full details on the surprisingly interesting saga of the development of the US Constitution and just how revolutionary it was at the time, which is often lost on us in modern times, do go check out our video, The Key to Humans Humaning, after you're done watching this video. But suffice it to say for now, after a whole lot of hot and sweaty political wrangling shut up, quite literally with windows closed and all to stop eavesdropping, in the summer of 1787, enough delegates, 39, were willing to sign the completed document that they came up with to approve it, despite that pretty much everyone had issues with elements of it. And so it was that the United States had a shiny new proposed constitution. After everyone signed, Ben Franklin would muse while looking at a painting of the sun on the chair George Washington, who had presided over the assembly, sat in. Often in the course of the session and the vicissitudes of my hopes and fears as to its issue, I looked at that behind the president without being able to tell whether it was rising or setting. But now, at length, I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. As to what happened after they all signed, according to George Washington, the remaining delegates all went out to the city tavern and had a party. It was done. Well, almost. It still needed ratified by the states to become official. When it was put before Massachusetts, however, the issue of whether to ratify it was highly contentious, despite its extreme similarity to the Massachusetts Constitution, from which it was partially based. Once again, going back to the Articles of Confederation, many within the states at the time heavily favored independence and a loose coalition and a weak central power uniting them. The new Constitution was proposing the opposite of that. Others were caught up in various details of it, everything from the term length for those elected, to it not including a Bill of Rights initially, to it not abolishing slavery as the Massachusetts Constitution had done via John Adams' inclusion of a Declaration of Rights, which critically had at the start, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. All of these arguments were basically the same that had been made in the United States Constitution's drafting, but they went ahead with it anyway. As Ben Franklin would sum up when the document was originally approved, there are several parts of this Constitution which I do not at present approve. I doubt, too, whether any convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution, for when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected? It therefore astonishes me to find this system approaching so near to perfection as it does. Thus I consent to this Constitution because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. Going back to Massachusetts, when the ratifying convention first met in January of 1788, Hancock was naturally elected president of the convention, despite his ailing health, which initially prevented him from attending the debates. As for his opinion on it all, he kept his cards very close to his chest, including when he was first presented a copy of the proposed new constitution. He stated it was not for him, to quote, to decide upon this momentous affair. However, in the early going, rumors swirled that Hancock opposed the measure, allegedly in no small part as it diminished his power as governor in some ways via putting a more powerful federal government over him. Other prominent individuals, such as Lieutenant Governor Samuel Adams, also seemed to be leaning that way too in the early going, though he would change his mind in the end. But before that, Samuel Adams would write to Richard Henry Lee on December the 5th, 1787, I confess, as I enter the building, I stumble at the threshold. I meet with a national government instead of a federal union of sovereign states. I am unable to conceive why the wisdom of the convention led them to give the preference to the former before the latter. If several states in the union are to become one entire nation under one legislature, the powers of which shall extend to every subject of legislation and its laws be supreme and control the whole, the idea of sovereignty in these states must be lost. With it seeming like ratification would not go through, Hancock finally did attend, having his servants carry him to the hall reportedly wrapped in flannels. There, on February the 6th, he gave a speech before the vote, throwing his support wholeheartedly behind ratification, stating, "I am happy that my health has been so far restored that I am rendered able to meet my fellow citizens as represented in this convention. I should have considered it as one of the most distressing misfortunes of my life to be deprived of giving my aid and support to a system which cannot fail to give the people of the United States a greater degree of political freedom, and eventually as much national dignity as falls to the lot of any nation on earth. That a general system of government is indispensably necessary to save our country from ruin is agreed upon all sides. That the one now to be decided upon has its defects, all agree. But when we consider the variety of interests and the different habits of the men it is intended for, it would be very singular to have an entire union of sentiment respecting it. But as the matter now stands, the powers reserved by the people render them secure, and until they themselves become corrupt, they will always have upright and able rulers. I give my assent to the Constitution. The question now before you is, such as no nation on earth, without the limits of America, has ever had the privilege of deciding upon, as the supreme ruler of the universe has seen fit to bestow upon us this glorious opportunity, let us decide upon it, appealing to him for the vicissitude of our intentions, and in humble confidence that he will yet continue to bless and save our country." When the votes were ultimately cast shortly after the speech, of the 355 voters, only 19 more were in favor of ratification versus against. With how close this ended up being, seeing many credit Hancock choosing to side with those in favor, swaying the outcome. In the aftermath, poor health or not, Hancock's popularity was still about as high as it could be among the masses, and he easily continued to win election after election as governor of Massachusetts. Had it not been for his health, given his relatively young age and extreme popularity in the new United States, in all likelihood, John Hancock would have had a decent shot at pulling off the trifecta of not just president of the Continental Congress and then president under the Articles of Confederation, but also president under the new United States Constitution at some point. Though, of course, Washington winning the first election was all but inevitable, and no one was surprised by that outcome. Speaking of that first election, well, as was the custom of the time, Hancock did not campaign or even express overt interest in the office of the presidency. He did receive 4 Electoral College votes anyway, 2 from Pennsylvania and 1 each from Virginia and South Carolina, and likely would have received significantly more if not for his boyhood friend in John Adams taking all the Massachusetts electoral votes, with Adams ultimately becoming vice president to George Washington partially because of it in 1789, and later the second president of the United States in 1797. But whether Hancock might have secured the role for himself at some point or not, it was not to be, as his health continued its rapid decline despite his relatively young age. Ultimately, John Hancock would pass away on October the 8th, 1793, at the age of only 56. Over 20,000 people attended his funeral, about 1 in 200 people in the United States at the time, and the date was ordered by now Massachusetts Governor Samuel Adams to be a state holiday. Hancock's final resting place is next to his Uncle Thomas at the Old Granary Burial Grounds in Boston. Now, if you followed along in this 5-part series, you might at this point be thinking it seems a rather odd thing that the likes of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and their many prominent cohorts would be so lauded in the aftermath, yet John Hancock was largely forgotten in popular history outside of his famous signature. As one of his biographers, Harlow Unger, would write, John Hancock's transformation from Tory patrician to fiery rebel is one of the least known stories of the Revolution, yet he was perhaps the consummate American hero. Even John Adams in 1809 had already observed this trend and lamented that both Samuel Adams and John Hancock, 2 of the biggest players in the early Revolution, had been so shunted to the side and, to quote Adams, almost buried in oblivion. So what happened? Well, as we can attest in doing our 5-video deep dive on the man, outside of countless letters pertaining to business transactions and later similar administrative letters during the Revolution, Hancock did not actually leave much in the way of personal writings for historians to gauge his thoughts, motivations, and perspectives as so many others of the Founding Fathers did. Most prominently, arguably, John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, who kept daily journals for huge portions of their lives, covering everything that was going on around them in their daily lives. The power of this is that it allows historians to view events and decisions from the individual's perspective to contrast from those of their political enemies and others speaking about them. Now, if you enjoy reading about business transactions and administration, you'll love diving into the John Hancock archives. But otherwise, he left relatively little of the rest, leaving most of what's said about him we remember today being written by his opposition in politics. And of this, while most describe him as an extremely able administrator and moderator of disputes, his propensity for insanely foppish dress and his perceived vanity from all this did not exactly endear him to many of the other leaders on a personal level. Given this type of excess and his extreme wealth were generally seen as contrary to the Republican ideals they were all fighting for. Further, at least by their accounts, and to be fair, you can see where it comes through in some of his own personal writings that have survived, he also seems to have enjoyed to an extreme degree his popularity with the masses. In a nutshell, he seems to have liked being famous, which was also seen as anti-Republican to revel in such things openly. This is partially why in the early going in the United States, it was tradition to not really promote yourself when running for offices like that of the president, but simply to let it be known you'd accept the position if elected, and then allow your constituents to take it from there. And even if you were elected, it was expected you'd say something like you didn't feel qualified for the job and you didn't really want it anyway, even though in most cases the opposite was very clearly true. You just couldn't say that. Thus, Hancock's more open ambition, fancy dress, perceived vanity, and excessive wealth worked against his reputation with, ironically, the other elite. As James Madison would state, Hancock is weak, ambitious, a courtier of popularity given to low intrigue. This about a man who was among the first to publicly call the colonists to fight and was steadfast in this in the early going when it was most likely to see him get hung for it. And he also had everything to lose in his immense fortune as well, even if he wasn't arrested and executed for treason. Sure doesn't seem weak at all. Sam Adams would also chime in, writing of the celebration Hancock held after he became governor of Massachusetts. John Hancock appears in public with all the pageantry of an oriental prince. He rides in an elegant chariot. He is attended by 4 servants dressed in superb livery, mounted on fine horses richly caparisoned, and escorted by 50 horsemen with drawn sabers, the one half of whom precede and the other follow his carriage. In stark contrast, and amazingly ironic if you really think about it, the masses on the whole seem to adore John Hancock thanks to his extreme philanthropy and generous nature, amiable personality, not just towards the elite, but to the masses at any station in life, his skill as an administrator during the Revolution, which was critical to its early success, and his bold patriotism despite what this cost him in a number of ways when so many others in similar positions sided with the British. In short, the masses seem to have had an entirely different opinion of the man, and there's a reason in the early going of the war there were rallying cries of King Hancock. But those masses died off, and historians, with very little to work with directly from the man, mostly only accounts from his political opponents, and with much of his more significant role in the Revolution being in helping to start it and, in the early going, administer it, well, let's just say writing letters to convince some governmental body or an individual to send more troops or resources, or arranging the funding and outfitting of the ship that sent the first diplomat to France to get that crucial aid there is not exactly as sexy as winning a major battle or drafting the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. Never mind the fact that if Hancock had not played such a prominent role in igniting the revolution in the first place, and then figuring out how to keep it going via his rather mundane administrative and mediating work, those major battle victories and everything after would not have happened. As historian Charles Akers would sum up, the chief victim of Massachusetts historiography has been John Hancock, the most gifted and popular politician in the Bay State's long history. He suffered the misfortune of being known to later generations almost entirely through the judgments of his detractors, Tory and Whig. But perhaps John Adams, one of the most distinguished of all of his era and who knew John Hancock from boyhood, would sum him up best, writing about Hancock a couple decades after Hancock's death, lamenting the way history remembered him, stating in 1812, "When will the character of Hancock be understood? Never. I could melt into tears when I hear his name. The property he possessed when his country called him would purchase Washington and Franklin both. If benevolence, charity, generosity were ever personified in North America, they were in John Hancock. What shall I say of his education, his literary acquisitions, his travels, his military, civil, and political services, his sufferings and sacrifices? I can say with truth that I profoundly admired him and more profoundly loved him. 5 years later, in 1817, Adams would expound upon all this considerably, writing, "I knew Mr. Hancock from his cradle to his grave. He was radically generous and benevolent. What shall I say of his fortune, his ships? At the time, not less than 1,000 families were, every day in the year, dependent on Mr. Hancock for their daily bread. Consider his real estate in Boston, in the country, in Connecticut, and the rest of New England. Had Mr. Hancock fallen asleep to this day, he would now awake one of the richest men. Had he persevered in business as a private merchant, he might have erected a house of Medicis, but no man's property was ever more entirely devoted to the public. The town had chosen Mr. Hancock into the legislature of the province. His mind was soon engrossed by public cares, alarms, and terrors. His business was left to subalterns, his private affairs neglected, and continued to be so to the end of his life." Adams concludes on John Hancock, "Though I never injured or justly offended him, and though I spent much of my time and suffered unknown anxiety in defending his property, reputation, and liberty from persecution, I cannot but reflect upon myself for not paying him more respect than I did in his lifetime. But if statues, obelisks, pyramids, or divine honors were ever merited by men of cities or nation, John Hancock deserved these from the United States." James Otis, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock were the three most essential characters in the Revolution, and Great Britain knew it, though America does not. Great and important and excellent characters aroused and excited by these arose in Pennsylvania, Virginia, New York, South Carolina, and in all the other states, but these three were the first movers, the most constant, steady, persevering springs, agents, and most disinterested sufferers and firmest pillars of the whole Revolution.